Every week, loads of you get in touch with me because you want my advice about piano practice. You want to know things like how long you should practice or how you should organise your practice routine. Quite a few of you are also interested in finding out how you can judge your own progress, typically because you're concerned that you're not progressing quickly enough and you want to know if you can speed things up a little bit. So what I'm going to do today is take you through my 5 essential tips for practicing the piano more effectively and more efficiently. These are all things that professional musicians kind of take for granted, but which might not be obvious to you if you're a relative beginner on the instrument or if you're an amateur player. Now, all of this stuff is pretty timely for me at the moment because, as some of you already know, I'm in the middle of writing a brand new book about how to be a better all-round musician, and clearly practicing effectively is a major part of that. Now, that book is slated for publication in autumn 2020, and when it comes out I'll add a find out more link to the description text that accompanies this video. And if you happen to be watching on YouTube, I'll also add one of those little YouTube cards that appear in the top right hand corner of the screen. Okay, on with the show. 5 tips for making your piano practice more efficient and more effective, starting with tip number 1, stop fretting about how much you practice. Instead, focus on how often you practice. That's because practicing just a little bit every single day of the week is much more effective than practicing in big chunks just once or twice a week. Now, professional musicians have known this for centuries, but these days psychologists have a name for the phenomenon. It's one aspect of what they call the spacing effect. To put it simply, when your brain is learning a complex new task, it takes time to lay down and reinforce the new connections it needs in order to master that task. And you can help it to do that more efficiently by keeping it topped up with these regular little reminders of what it's supposed to be doing. If you just hit it with big blasts of information every now and then, it finds that harder to process. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, for most of us, it means that 20 or 30 minutes a day of focused practice, and we'll come on to what that means in a second, 20 or 30 minutes a day of focused practice 6 or 7 days a week is absolutely fine. You'll often hear classical and jazz musicians at the top of their game saying that they practice for 6 or 7 hours a day or however long, and yes, often they do. But don't aim for that as an ideal. Those guys are the real professionals. They have to be the top 10th of 1% in the world, okay? And practicing for that long carries risks. First of all, you risk injury. Lots of professional musicians have major problems with repetitive strain injury. And secondly, you set yourself up for failure. If you say to yourself, I'm going to practice 2 hours a day every day, then when you fail to meet that goal, as you inevitably will, you feel like a failure and you get demoralized. Much better to aim for that achievable 20 or 30 minutes a day, 6 or 7 days a week. And you should find that that is the absolute ideal for making steady progress, especially if you're in your first few years of learning the instrument. Tip number 2, always remember that there's a difference between playing the piano and practicing the piano. If you just sit down at your piano and play through stuff that you're already comfortable with, then that's great. You'll really enjoy yourself, and being able to do that is one of the reasons that you learn the instrument in the first place. But don't kid yourself that that is practice, because it's not. Practice is, by definition, always challenging. And that's because when you practice, what you're trying to do is send a signal to your brain that it needs to upgrade itself to meet the demands of a difficult new task. And if your practice feels easy, it's just not going to get that message. It's a little bit like going to the gym. If you walk into your local gym and pick up a really light weight, you might be able to lift that for 60, 70, 80 repetitions. You might get tired eventually, but fundamentally your body can meet the demand that you're placing on it. And because of that, it won't bother upgrading. It won't see the point, okay? Instead, what you need to do is pick up a heavy weight that you can only lift for 8 or 9 or 10 repetitions and do that. Lift that consistently. Then your body sees that there's a challenge that it is being consistently presented with because you're training day after day, week after week, and in response it will upgrade itself. It will meet the challenge. You will get stronger muscles. Your brain works the same way when you're learning a tough new skill like playing the piano. Okay, you need to put yourself in a position of consistent challenge. So if you're practicing and it feels easy, that is not practice. But here's the thing, you mustn't challenge yourself too much. You need to stay in a kind of sweet spot between challenging and achievable. If you work on material that is too difficult, that's almost worse than working on stuff that's too easy. It would be like thinking, you know, I need to get stronger, so I'll go and lift an elephant. The task would be so far out of your range that you wouldn't make any progress at all. So always stay in that challenging but achievable sweet spot. Tip number 3, don't worry too much about your rate of progress on the piano. Now, based on a lot of the emails and messages I get, quite a few of you do worry about your rate of progress, and honestly, usually it's needless. Now, if you're making no progress at all over a period of months, then that suggests that something does indeed need to change. Chances are that either you're working on material that's too difficult for you, in which case make it more achievable, or you're not practicing often enough, in which case aim for the 6 or 7 days a week that I was talking about earlier, or perhaps you're working with a course or a teacher that doesn't really suit you. And no one piano teacher or piano course works for everybody, so don't feel bad if you have to make a change. But as long as you're making some sort of progress, don't worry too much about how fast it is. It's not really worth worrying about progress because learning the piano, like any complex skill, tends to proceed in fits and starts. Yeah, the way you develop and the rate at which you develop will be non-linear. Sometimes you'll have very quick periods of development, then you'll have a plateau, then another quick period of development, then another plateau. And it's really hard to predict when those different phases will come. So when it comes to assessing your own progress, it's pretty pointless trying to do it over the short term. Don't sit down and practice and say, how does this sound compared to last week? Okay, you can do that sometimes, but don't make a habit of it. It's much better to say, how does this compare to last month? Okay, or even better, 6 months ago. Now, how do you judge that? Because actually it's very hard to judge subjectively. If you try to think back to how you were playing 6 months ago, you might deceive yourself, and in fact you'll tend to be hard on yourself, which might lead you to get demoralized. A really good way of making it objective is to every now and then video or record yourself playing the piano. Then you can save that recording and 6 months later or 3 months later or however long come back to it and use it as a comparison. And that will show you your real rate of progress. Even better, it will show you your rate of progress in sub-skills. So 6 months down the line, you can look at a video of yourself playing 6 months previously and say, okay, I've got better at dynamic control, good, but yeah, my legato and fingering isn't everything it should be, so I can really focus on that area. Tip number 4, attack the problem. Now, most amateur players, when they're learning a new piano piece or learning how to improvise over a new chord progression or song or whatever, will just go through the process of playing it over and over and over. They might divide it into sections, beginning, middle and end, but fundamentally their approach is just to play through this piece or through this song lots and lots of times, and that's how they learn it, okay? Now, when you're just starting out with a new project, that can work fine. In fact, it's a good way of getting to grips with a new piece, yeah? But what the professionals do when things get difficult is find the problem areas and isolate them. What amateurs tend to do is just to keep playing through, and they'll get to the point where they can play most of the piece, but there'll just be 1 or 2 problem areas that they just kind of bump over every time they play through. And they might spend the whole half-hour practice session playing this piece over and over again, and most of the time they'll be playing stuff that they can play, yeah? But they'll just have these little bumpy sections, and that's inefficient. The professionals take those problem areas out, take them to bits, slow them down, play them lots and lots of times, maybe spend 20 minutes just playing a single bar over and over again, attacking the problem, and then when the problem is solved, they'll drop it back into the piece, okay? So don't be one of those amateurs who just plays through from beginning to end over and over and over again. Always identify and attack the problems. Finally, tip number 5, always remember to listen and pay attention when you're practicing or playing the piano. If you and I were violinists or singers, we wouldn't have this problem, and that's because we would have to focus all the time on producing the sound using our breath and our vocal cords if we were singers, and our shoulder, arm and hand if we were violinists, and also on tuning the sound. Yeah? But the piano does most of that work for us. Sure, we have an influence over the dynamics, the louds and softs. Yes, we can influence things like phrasing and legato and staccato, but once we have pressed a key, the piano takes over and does most of the work of producing that sound. And that means that when you're playing the piano, it is fatally easy to zone out and just get into the mechanical process of pressing the right notes at the right times. And that's a shame, because once you're doing that, you've lost focus on the really important things. Just pressing the right note at the right time is in some ways the least important part of playing the piano. The most important part is putting in the expression, the musicality, the grace, all of the stuff that makes your music worth listening to. So, the big problem here is that if you are conscientious and you practice every day, you're more likely to run into this problem. You sit down, you do your practice, you play your scales, you play your pieces, but before you know it, your brain has wandered off elsewhere, you're planning a holiday, you're mentally writing a shopping list or something, and your hands are just mechanically pressing the right notes at the right time. Now, that means you're not making effective music, and it also possibly means if you're practicing rather than playing, you're not really challenging yourself. You're just playing through stuff that you can play quite comfortably. So you need to get into the habit of consistently listening to the music that you make. One way to do that is to avoid making your practice routine too routine. Yeah, by all means practice at the same time every day, and by all means start with a warm-up, because that's good for your hands and prevents injury. But then within your practice session, mix and match things up. Sometimes play a few scales, then one of your pieces, then a few more scales, then a song you're improvising on, or play your scales in a different order, or play one of your pieces with the last section first. Anything to make things a little bit unusual, a little bit different, so you don't purely get into the zone. If you have an attack the problem mentality, then that is much easier, because every practice session will have at least part of it dedicated to identifying the problems in a particular piece or a particular song and trying to deal with them.